Good evening once again, my ECO 2301 students. We're making significant progress, moving towards the finish line now for this class. So I'm going to be talking about a chapter on inflation, because as I said on day one, there are three main macroeconomic topics that, all the variables that macroeconomists care about. We want to know as macroeconomists about what drives the strength of the economy. And we talked about one of the things that if somebody asks you to tell them about how strong the US economy is, you're going to tell them, of course, about the production capability of the country, how much we're producing. Are we making progress productively in terms of GDP, growth, how much we're producing? The other second measure that we really care about is the state of the labor market, which is unemployment, which is a measure of joblessness. So if the economy is strong, the strength of the economy is basically going to be depicted by low unemployment. When employment growth is exploding, we say that the economy is strong. And then, of course, the third, another measure of macroeconomics that we really care about is a measure of the cost of living, which is inflation. You all know that about 4 or 5 years ago, or 3 years ago, if your family went to HEB with maybe $150 or $200, they could actually buy a significant amount of groceries. If you go with $200 today at HEB, you may not get groceries. You may get something very small compared to what you would buy with it 4 years ago. So that is inflation in play there. Inflation is a persistent increase in the price level. So the goal of this lecture today, we're going to talk about define inflation, talk about how economists measure inflation, and then we're going to talk about a popular theory that links inflation with some other macroeconomic variables, which we're going to be calling the quantity theory of money. And then we shall discuss, after we have established what causes inflation, we're going to discuss the effects of inflation on society, the effect that inflation imposes on the Americans. So we'll talk about the economic cost of inflation. So let me share my screen here, then we'll talk about it. So this is going to be chapter 31, I believe. Yes, yes, on your textbook. So we're going to talk about inflation and the quantity theory of money, and here's going to be our outline. We're going to define inflation and talk about how economists measure inflation, and then we shall talk about the quantity theory of money, and then we shall talk about the cost of inflation. Okay, and then some key takeaways. So just some basic talking points here. President Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe was one of the the leaders who took over as president of that. Used to be a very vibrant country that borders South Africa. So Zimbabwe in 1980s, when I was growing up, used to be what they call the breadwinner of Africa. It used to be a very vibrant economy. But somewhere in the 90s, early 90s, President Robert Mugabe did some kind of crazy land reforms where he seized all the land that were, land which was owned by British farmers who were doing large-scale commercial farming. He claimed that the land belonged to the Africans, and he chased all those the commercial farmers who were mainly British or British descent from their farmland, and then distributed the land to his cronies in government, the Africans. But the problem is that the Africans whom he gave the land to did not know how to farm very well. So the farm sector collapsed in Zimbabwe. Keeping in mind that the commercial farming sector used to be the place where the government would get tax revenue. That's where we get bread and butter. But once the farm sector collapsed, that was an interesting turning point for Zimbabwe. And then, of course, the Western nations imposed lots of sanctions, economic sanctions on Zimbabwe, especially Great Britain and the West in general. So the economy collapsed. Okay, so the action by Robert Mugabe drove away entrepreneurs and investors from the Zimbabwean economy. So a country that was one time the breadwinner of sub-Saharan Africa, was reduced to a country that was on its knees, struggling, with all aspects of economic problems. So to bribe his enemies and pay the army, he simply printed more money. Because remember, when he chased the commercial, the commercial farmers, and the farm sector collapsed, there was not enough tax revenue coming in, because that's where we used to get a lot of tax revenue. But he still needed to pay the army, pay a lot of government employees, but the government had no money. So they resorted to printing money to pay their bills. So the economy was flooded with money, but could not produce more goods and services. Okay. So that was the beginning of inflation, because inflation, as we're going to be talking about, to a lay person, inflation basically means too much money chasing too few goods. If you print too much money and dump it in the economy, the result is inflation. Prices are going to rise. So when I was a little kid, I used to walk with my dad and ask several questions. I was a 9, 10-year-old. I was asking my dad, why is this neighborhood so poor? Why can't the government just print money and drop it from the sky so that these people could be, maybe everybody could get $10,000 more, and they become a little bit, richer, and maybe that would, their situation would improve. My dad told me that would be a very bad idea. I said, and I asked him why, because he told me that maybe it was beyond the scope, that he could not tell me why it was bad. Maybe that's the reason why I decided to major in economics, to find out why printing money and distributing it in the communities that needed it the most would actually be problematic than, but the key idea is that if you print money and dump it in the economy, what is going to happen? The people are going to use this money, start spending it rapidly. If the amount of goods and services they're spending this money on are not enough, then the prices on those goods are going to go up. So at the end of it all, even though they have got some short-term gains when the government gives them this money, in the long run, prices of milk might go up tenfold. Maybe a gallon of milk at HEB could go from $3 to $10. Everything's going to be very expensive. So at the end of the day, everybody's going to lose out because of higher prices. So in Zimbabwe, for example, prices went up. The inflation rate increased from 50% per year to 50% per month, to more than 50% per day. You can imagine. That's how bad it was. So inflation is going to be defined as is an increase, the percentage increase in the average level of prices. Okay, so you can say an increase in the average level of prices. The opposite of inflation, which I should discuss it right away, is deflation. Deflation is the opposite of inflation. So deflation, again, is a decrease in the average level of prices. So I want you to take a look at the definition here. When we say the average level of prices, what do we really mean? In the chapter of GDP, we talked about it. We said that in a macroeconomy like the United States, the economy as a whole, there's only one price. Okay, so here we're not talking about the price of a single good, like the price of gasoline or the price of baby cereal or the price of pairs of shoes, price of what. We're not talking about the price of individual goods. We're talking about the average prices of all goods and services. And in chapter 8, one way that economists measure that price was what we call the GDP deflator. If you remember from chapter 8, chapter 20, I believe it's chapter 26, yes, 26. We define a measure of that price level in the economy, a measure of the average price level or the general price level. You can call it the general price level or the average price level. Is the GDP deflator. GDP deflator. I remember the formula for it was what? You take nominal GDP and you divide it by real GDP, multiplied by 100. That's how we measure price. If you know nominal GDP in a year, say 2024, you take nominal GDP in 2024, divide by real GDP in 2024, multiplied by 100. That is going to give you the price level or the general price level or the average price level in the US economy in 2024. Today, I'm going to show you guys another way of measuring that price level, which we're going to be calling the consumer price index. shortly. But after we know whether you measure that price using the GDP deflator or what they call the consumer price index or the producer price index, inflation is going to be measured by changes in that price index, the percentage increase in the price index. And you guys know how to calculate the percentage increase of something, okay? So let's say P1 is a price of a good in period one. Period one could be 2023. And then period two, that's a general price level, say in 2024. And people want to ask, what is inflation in 2024 compared to price, last year? So you're going to take the price in 2024 minus the price 2023, divide by price in 2023, multiply by 100. Very simple. Okay. So you can see when we have different prices of goods and services, like in year one, we quantify, we get the average of those prices to get some kind of average price level in the economy. Okay. And we could call this, if this year one is what we're going to be calling the base year, this could be like year two, where the average price has doubled from 100 to 200. Okay. So if the price index is 200 in year one and 210 in year two, then the rate of inflation is going to be, we talked about that already. The rate of inflation is going to be, you take the percentage increase in the price level from period one to period two. That's going to be price level in period two minus price level in period one, divided by price level in period one. Then you multiply this by 100. Very simple. So in this case, the price level in period two is 210 minus the price level in period one, which is 200, divided by price level in period one, 200, and then you multiply this number by 100. So you get 10 over 200, okay, times 100. So you see, 0 cancel, so 2 goes out 5. So that means the rate of inflation is 5%. So B is going to be the correct choice, okay? So that's what we do here. Okay, so I'll talk about price indexes. So in chapter 26, I already showed you that the GDP deflator, which is a ratio of nominal to real GDP multiplied by 100, covers finished goods and services. Honestly, basically, but there's another way of measuring the price level, which we're going to talk about today, which is a consumer price index. So the consumer price index measures the average price for a basket of goods and services bought by a typical American consumers. Typically, when the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which computes these prices, is computing, they look at a typical American urban family of 4. Family size of 4. What kinds of goods do typical American urban families of 4 normally purchase every period? So what they do, they send surveys to about 60,000 American families and asking them what their spending was on those goods, what are the different types of goods they're buying, so the Bureau will get an idea what the different goods are in the basket. So that typically covers about 80,000 different types of goods and services, and it's weighted so major items count more. So if gasoline is one of the major products that American families are buying, we assign a higher weight in computing that CPI, a higher weight on gasoline. If housing seems to be one of the most important things. Everybody needs always strive to have a roof on their head. So housing is going to be weighted more in that basket. Housing values, housing prices, like mortgages and stuff like that, or rentals, how much you're renting, an apartment, whatever it is. And then there's another way. So consumer price index is going to measure the price on consumer goods, which that means final goods that are bought by consumers. Producer price index, though, the form, is this kind of same idea. It measures the average price received by producers. And that also includes intermediate and finished goods and services. So basically, with the producer price index, you are tracking the price of goods that are purchased by a typical American producer. A typical American producer is going to buy like raw material goods to produce goods and services. They're going to buy labor. They need people to work. They're going to buy capital. Okay? They're going to buy energy. So the goods that are purchased by a producer are typically different from the goods that are purchased by a consumer. Okay? So sometimes we want to know what is the general price level for goods that are purchased by American producers, typically capital goods. or intermediate goods. Okay. So for Americans, the consumer price index is a more relevant measure of price level. CPI is a measure of inflation that corresponds most directly to their daily economic circumstance or activity. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is the same federal bureau that computes unemployment, which I showed you when we were doing the unemployment chapter, is the same bureau that is in charge computing the consumer prices. And the consumer prices are computed annually and also monthly. They report two numbers. They look at, so if they're looking at the consumer price index for the month of July, they want to see how prices of these goods have changed from the month of June to July. So month to month changes in prices. But they also look at annual. They look at how the average prices of goods were in July of last year, 2023, to July of 2024. That would be annual or CP changes in the CPI when they're looking at inflation in an annual context. So it tries to take both new goods and higher quality goods into account when computing the CPI. Okay, I'll show you kind of like so this is the inflation rate for the United States going back to 1950s to more recent times. So inflation was highest in the late 1970s going to the 80s, early 80s. See that? And one of the reasons inflation in America peaked at about 15%. And if you ask me what was the reason for that inflation, I told you that in the 1970s, America used to rely on oil coming from what? Gasoline, oil coming from the Persian Gulf. We were not a major oil producing country in the 1970s. We were so heavily reliant on oil that we would import from Saudi Arabia, those countries like Kuwait, you know. So what happened was that all those countries in the Persian Gulf are part of the OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, this oil cartel that we talked about in our previous chapter. So what OPEC did in 1974 and 75, they basically raised the global the price of oil from $7 a barrel to $38 a barrel by cutting the supply of oil. That's what they did. They cut the supply of oil, and oil prices went to the roof. But we know that everything that if oil prices go to the roof, that triggers consumer prices going up, because everything product that the consumer buys must always be transported at least from point A to point B to point C. So if oil prices are going up, transportation costs go up, that always going to trigger into what? Higher consumer prices. So the main cause of this inflation in the late 70s going to the 80s was basically the oil price shock in the United States, a global oil price shock that made the cost of producing goods very high, and that translated into higher consumer prices. But since then, inflation have been tamed down in America. That we have had a very low and stable inflation from the 90s and the 2000s. So the effect of inflation on price. So there's going to be what they call a cumulative effect of inflation on a large basket of goods. That's right. If inflation is going to be going up higher, then the cumulative effect is that prices could rise. Like you see in 1915, a basket of goods, the same basket of goods that people are buying, like say 1965, only cost $10. So 1965 was 36.70. And then in around 1994, 1990, it was 100. And then you can see in 2019, it jumped to 256. So that's consumer price index for you. So that means things have gotten more and more expensive over time. So we're also going to be defining the real price. The real price that has been corrected for inflation. Real prices are used to compare the price of goods over time. But before I talk about real prices, your textbook kind of doesn't show you a little bit how we calculate the CPI. I want to show you how we calculate, and we do an example here. So I'm going to open up a slide here. So here I'm going to talk about how to calculate, how to calculate the consumer price index. Which is a CPI. So what the Bureau of Labor Statistics does, these are the process, okay? They are going to survey Americans, asking them what types of goods they buy. Typical Americans. We're talking about typical American goods that any typical family buys. We're not talking about goods like private jets or expensive stuff, luxury like Lamborghini. No, that's not the good. The Lamborghini is not a good that a typical American family buys. It has to be things like simple things like groceries, different types of things that go in grocery, like pork, maybe apples, maybe oranges when you're doing groceries, apparel, shoes, stuff like that, gasoline, okay, housing. So the Bureau is gonna sell whatever, come up with what? The goods that constitute a basket, So for the United States, the CPI, the Bureau is the number of goods in is about 80,000 goods and services, different types of goods and services that are in that basket. And then what they're gonna do, they're gonna track the price of each good within a basket every month. Every month or every year, depending on the frequency where they want to compute how prices have changed over time. And then in the basket, there's fixed what? There is fixed amount of goods. So the Bureau is going to assume that if oranges are part of is one of the goods among the 80,000 goods and services, they're going to assume that in every month, a typical American family buys 20 oranges. So the number of oranges they buy does not change every period. There's fixed number of each good within a basket. If they purchase 15 apples every month, 15 is going to be 15 every month or 15 every year, whatever the frequency of time you're dealing with here. If they purchase 15 gallons of gasoline every month, it's going to be 50 gallons. So the quantity of each good does not change. There's fixed number of amount of goods within the basket. Okay. What they're tracking is the price of each of those goods, how it's changing. For example, they might say, what was the price of an apple in June 2024? And what was the price of the same apple in May 2024? What's the price of that apple in March 2024, April 2024? So because price of an apple is going to change every month. Then they're doing that on oranges. What's the price of an orange? What's the price of a gallon of gasoline every month? That's what they're doing. That's why track the price for each good. Okay, and then what we shall do here, what the Bureau is going to do, they're going to compute the cost or expenditure on the basket. So we're going to compute the cost of a basket of those 80. How much does it cost to buy those 80,000 different goods and services each month? Compute the cost of a basket each month. And then they will select a base year period. Select a base period. A base period is a period where the Bureau may think prices have remained relatively stable. But sometimes the choice of a base period is arbitrary. But most likely, they do it in such a way they look at a period where prices of goods and services have remained relatively stable. Okay. And then now the formula for CPI. So the CPI for any given period, like for the calculate the CPI, say for the month of July 2024, is going to be, let's say, it's going to be the cost of a basket in the current period is a period that you're calculating a CPI, divided by the cost of the same market basket, cost of the same basket in a base period. And then we multiply this by 100. That's a formula for the CPI. I want to do example. Of course, we cannot do an example with 80,000 different types of goods. That's not feasible. But the beauty is actually, in reality, they're tracking the price of goods and services on 80 different types of items. For our example, let's just do an example where we assume that there are only 2 goods in a basket, just so you get the idea how we calculate the CPI. Okay, so let's suppose okay, so let's say, suppose a basket comprises of 20 apples, and this is just hypothetical, and 10 oranges. So let's say in June 2024, the price of an orange, say P orange means price of an orange was, let's just pretend to be like, let's say it was 25 cents, 0.25 per orange. And then the price of an apple, let's say it was 50 cents, 0.50 dollars. And then let's say in July 2024, the price of an orange jumped to 50 cents. And the price of an apple jumped to 75 cents. And then, so now the question then is, if June 2024 is the base year, is the base period, calculate the CPI for Roman 1, June 2024, Roman 2, July 2024. Now, I have to be clear, just like we talked about the GDP deflator of chapter 26, when somebody asks you to calculate the consumer price index because remember, June 2024, we said is a base year. The CPI for the base year period is always 100. Don't even waste your time calculating. Okay, but anyway, here's what you do. So Roman 1, you're gonna get, it's gonna be 100, but let's do it. So we're gonna say CPI for June 2024. The formula is you take the cost of the basket in June divided by the cost of the basket in the base year period. And it's in this case, the base period is also June. So it's the same thing. Then you multiply this by, that's why I'm saying you don't have to waste your time, but I'm going to show you anyway. So in this case, it's going to be the cost of the basket in June. You're going to take the price of an orange in June, which is 25 cents. So you take the price of an orange times the quantity of orange. Q stands for the quantity that the consumer is buying, plus the price of an apple in June times the quantity in June. Then you're going to divide that number by, you divide this by the price of an orange times the quantity of the orange in June, because that's the same base year is June, plus the price of an apple in June, base year period times the quantity of an the quantity. You don't have to say quantity because the quantity is fixed in every period. And then you multiply this by 100. So it turns out that these numbers are going to be the same because it's going to be the June. So this is going to be 1. 1 times 100 is going to be 100. So in a base year period, don't waste your time calculating the CPI. The CPI in a base year period is always going to be equal to 100. But the CPI in any other year is not going to be 100. It's going to be different. So let's look at the CPI for the month of July. Okay, so see, yeah, so follow here. So consumer price index, CPI for July. The formula said you take the cost of the basket in July. That's like your current period, the period you're calculating the CPI, divide by the cost of the basket in the base year period, basket in the base period. And our base period, we say it is June. Then you multiply this by 100. It's very simple. So that means the consumer price index for July, for the month of July, is going to be, you're going to take the price of an orange in July times the quantity of oranges that always purchased. Remember, the quantity doesn't change every period. There's fixed quantity purchased of each good by the consumer. That's the assumption the bureau makes. So Q does not change every period. Plus the price of an apple in July times the quantity of apple, right? Purchase. Then divide this by the price of an orange in June. That's a base year period times the quantity plus the price of an apple in June times the quantity. Okay, then we multiply this by 100. Very simple. So that your answer would be, so let's plug in the numbers. So we have been told in that simple, this simple example that what? The price of an orange in the month of July was went up to 50 cents from 25 cents. And the price of an apple went to 75 cents. So that means the CPI, you plug in these now for July. So we're going to be plugging the price of orange in July is going to be 0.50. That's 50 cents times how many oranges did you say the consumer was buying? They're buying 10 oranges. Okay, so you multiply this by 10 plus the price of an apple in July 2024, which we said jumped to 75 cents an apple. Multiply this by the number of apples purchased, which is 20. Then you're going to divide this by the cost of purchasing those two baskets in the base period. In the base period, we've been told that the price of an orange was 25 cents, 0.25. Multiply that by 10, plus the price of an apple was 50 cents in the base period, 0.5 times 20 apples. Then we multiply this by 100. So this is going to be equals to 0.5 times 10, that is 5, plus 0.7, this is dollars, so 0.75 times 20, that is going to be 1.5 right? Divided by 0.25 times 10, that's gonna be $2.50, that's 2.5, plus 0.5 times 20, that's gonna be 2, right? No, it's gonna be so 0.5, this is gonna be it's gonna be 10. Yes, because we're multiplying this. I think I need to be careful here. This is 7.5 times 2. This is gonna be 15 here, not 1.5. This is $15 up here. So this one is gonna be 10. $10. That's right. Okay. Let's check just to make sure. We know 0.5 times 10, that is 5. 0.75 times 20, that's 7.5 times 2, that's 15, that's correct. Then this 0.25 times 10, that's 2.5, that's correct. Yeah, that's right. Then you multiply this by 100. So this is going to be equals to $20 on top divided by $12.5 times 100. So the dollar sign cancel. So it's going to be 20 divided by 12.5 times 100, which is just going to be, this is just the same thing as 2,000 divided by 12.5. So check it on my calculator here. So that's 2,000 divided by 12.5. So that means the CPI for July 2024 is 160. So that's how we calculate the CPI. So you can calculate the CPI for any month or for any year. But sometimes we calculate annual CPI, but this is monthly. Okay, but that's a formula. You take the cost of the market basket in a month or year, you're calculating CPI divided by the cost of the same market basket in the base period times 100. So it's very simple. Okay, so let's proceed now. So the real price is a price that has been corrected for inflation. Real price are used to compare the price of goods over time. Okay. So for example, let's say we're comparing let's say 1982 is a base year. We want to compare prices of gasoline in 2006 using what? The base year, what? Base year period, correcting for inflation. So the price, so what you're gonna do to get the what? To calculate the real price of gasoline, okay, in say 2006, you're gonna take the actual price. You see, you're gonna take the what? You take the consumer price index in 2006. You divide it by the consumer price index in the base year period, and then you multiply that by the price of gasoline in the base year period. So this 2.53 is actually the price of gasoline corrected for inflation. That means 2.5, which is the actual price of gasoline you're paying at the pump, was not corrected for. If you correct for inflation, it would be 2.53. So the real price of gasoline adjusted for inflation actually was slightly higher, not lower. This should be higher in 2006 than it was in 1982. Like when you think about it, no, it should be lower. Yeah, that's right. Yes, because we are corrected for inflation. Okay. Let's look at inflation rate in selected countries. In 2016, South Sudan, which is one of those youngest, the newest countries that was formed in 2011, the inflation in South Sudan in 2016 was 476%. Can you believe this? Venezuela was like 500%. They're at the highest approaching. But both Venezuela and South Sudan, the inflation was approaching 500%. That's the highest in the world. Meanwhile, Italy, Greece, and Japan had slight deflation, because anytime you calculate changes in price, you get negative. That is deflation. Deflation is when price is a general price decrease in the economy. The United States, you can see that the inflation was about 1.2%. So hyperinflation is another scenario. Hyperinflation comes when prices increase and are so out of control that the concept of inflation is meaningless. In fact, prices in a hyperinflation scenario would be rising at a rate more than 50% every month, when average inflation rates are rising for 50% every month. So you can see the only time America had inflation was way back before even we gain independence. No, sorry. Oh no, we gained in 1776. So it ended about 4 years after we gained independence, 1777 to 1780. Prices, cumulative inflation in the United States was 2,702%. Okay, maximum rate on a monthly basis was 1,342. But ever since that, the United States has never had any hyperinflation. But look at Bolivia. It was 92,282 in between 1984 to 1985. That country in South America had the highest, very high inflation. Look at Peru. The rate of inflation was 17,991,287%. That's unbelievable. For Yugoslavia, I cannot even, this is like in the rate of inflation of close to like billion% every year. Germany, because Germany printed a lot of money to go to war, and they were forced to pay reparation for war crimes during World War I. German inflation was out of control. From every month, the German inflation was rising at a rate of about 3.2 million%. That's just ridiculous. And then Zimbabwe has had one of the highest inflation in history. Hungary. So these are kind of exceptional inflationary problems that have occurred around the world in many countries experience around the world. So as I said, a real price is a price that has been corrected for inflation. We talked about that. So now let's talk about the quantity theory of money. The quantity theory of money is basically, it sets out a general relationship between money, velocity, real output, and prices. It helps to explain the critical role of money in determining the inflation rate. That's right. So I want to talk about it here. So I'm going to start by defining what those concepts are. Velocity. When we talk about real output, that's the same thing as real GDP. You already know how to calculate real GDP. Basically, value the total amount of output that the economy has produced in a given time period. Okay, well, that's what we call real output or real GDP. So our notation here, velocity, we're going to say V stands for velocity. And velocity is going to be defined as the average number of times that each dollar bill is spent. Or you can define it as the average number of times that each dollar bill changes hands in a period. A period could be a year, could be in a month. For example, if I go to my bank and I withdraw one new dollar bill, and then I go with that dollar bill in a convenience store and buy a pack of gum with it. So I've given somebody my dollar bill. And then the owner of that convenience store may use that dollar bill to pay their employee. And then their employee goes and spends that dollar in Walmart. And Walmart uses that dollar bill to pay their employee. The employee goes and spends in Target. So that same dollar bill can travel around multiple times. So if that dollar bill changes hands, like say 7 times or 100 times in a year, then we say the velocity of money is 100. That means the dollar bill has changed hands 100 times. Okay? So when people are if people are more people try to spend money more quickly, the velocity is going to be high. If people are very thrifty, like you get a dollar bill and you put it in a wallet and you say, this is mine now, I'm not going to spend it, then the velocity is most likely going to be low. Okay? And then we're going to define output. Let's just do whatever they already defined here. So I already defined what velocity is. And then M is going to be the money supply. This is going to be the total stock of dollar, total stock of money in the economy. Could be in trillions of dollars. Maybe we have $5 trillion of dollars of US dollars that is circulating in the economy, or which people are holding at home in their hands. Okay, money supply, we call that money supply. And then the price level is the general price of that. We could be a consumer price index that we talked about, or the GDP deflator, depending on how you measure it. And then I just talk about velocity. And real GDP is going to be defined as Y with an subscript R to emphasize that is real output, real GDP. So think about it for a second. Since if you multiply M times V, this is what they call a quantity theory money. It says that the product of total money supply in the economy, or stock of money that exists in the economy, multiplied by the number of times that each dollar bill out of that total money stock is changing hands. That should give you the value of output that we are producing. Because remember, YR is real output. If you multiply that real output times price, this P times Y R is the value, or the total value, market value of all final goods and services. Because remember, people are trying to use money to buy those final goods and services. So the key idea is that this notation should be, this identity should be true by definition. That if V is a average number of times that each dollar bill is changing hands, if I multiply that number of times an average dollar bill changing hands times the amount of money, total stock of dollars exists in the economy, that should be equivalent to the value of goods and services that we are using our dollars to purchase in the economy. That's what that definition means, that MV equals to PYR. So since MV is the total amount spent on finished goods, services, and PYR is the price level times real GDP, both sides of this equation are also equal in nominal GDP. So you could think about, if YR is real GDP, if you multiply real GDP by price, P times YR is nominal GDP, the market value of goods and services in dollars. That must equal to the what? The amount of money that is spent on those goods, which is M times V. So I say velocity is the average number of times a dollar is spent on finished goods and services in a year. In short, it refers to how fast money passes from one holder to the next. That's right. Average number of times money changes hands. So we're going to assume that both real GDP and velocity are stable. They're constant compared to money supply and prices. So real GDP is fixed by real factors of production, capital, labor, and technology. That's what you're assuming that. So if economy has already maximized on its capital, labor, and technology, you can no longer increase output, because that's the best you can do. Okay, so we're assuming that at every point the economy is producing at its maximum capacity. You're producing at your maximum capacity. That means you've already fully exhausted your capital, labor, and technology. Then your output is going to be fixed. The only way you can increase output is when you change, you build more capital, you increase labor, or you invent some new technology. But if those stay the same, then your output is going to remain constant. And then we're also going to assume that the average number of times that a dollar bill changes hands in the United States is going to be fixed, which is about, most estimates about seven times. So when I put a bar on V, because to emphasize that V is constant, we're assuming that the average number of times a dollar bill changes and is constant. We're also assuming that our real GDP, or real output, is also what? Constant. So if you're holding Y constant, YR constant, velocity constant, that means, according to this simple model, any change in the money supply, if the central bank, like the Federal Reserve, increases the stock, prints more money, and dumps that money in the economy, the only thing that get affected is that prices of goods are going to rise. And that's the definition of inflation. Inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. So when V and Y are fixed, indicated by the top bar, increase in M must cause increase in P in the same proportion. Meaning that if the Federal Reserve or the central bank doubles the money supply, price level is going to double, because we are holding V and Y constant. Let's do a simple example here, so that with numbers, so you see what I'm talking about. Just to clear up the, make sure that you understand this well. So let's just say, suppose V is 7 but we're saying that V is constant. Sorry, 7. And we're assuming that your Y, or real GDP, or real output, let's say is 100. And then let's say P, okay, is 2. And M is maybe, so I'm trying to make this make sense here. Let's say, let's say P was 7 too, just to be very, and then M was 100. So you can see if I multiply M times V bar, that must equal to P times what? YR. Because your M is what? Is 100 multiplied by V, which is going to be what? 7. That gives you 700 on the left. That must equal to P, which is what? 7 times YR, which is 100. So it's going to be true by the end. So sometimes I may give you 3 of the 4 variables, and I ask you to calculate what? The other variable. So let's do a couple examples here. Okay, so suppose M is 200 and P is, say, 4. And let's say V equals to 2. Then I could ask you, what is YR? So you know the identity. The formula says M times V must equal to what? P times YR. So you guys gonna substitute the known values and solve for unknown. You know, M is 200 here. Substitute that times V is 2 must equal to P is 4, then times YR. That's what we're gonna solve for. So that means 4 is very simple. 400 equals to 4 YR. So solving for YR, you divide both sides by 4. So 4 goes into 400 100 times. So that means your YR is going to be 100. I may also ask you a question. What is nominal GDP? You know, we're saying that, I'm going to say, what is nominal GDP? Nominal GDP, remember, is P what? P Y R. So that would just be the same thing as price is what? We've been given our price as what? Price is 4, and Y is now what? 100. So it's just gonna be just 4 times 100. So your nominal GDP, which is PYR, equals to 400. So it's very simple to compute. Okay, now I want to share with you, because now the model is predicting. How does this model predict this simple model? The model, are we saying that when you hold velocity and real GDP constant, increase in money supply is going to lead to an equal increase in what? Proportionate increase in price. Okay, so the model predicts that it's a 1-to-1 relationship. So the model predicts a 1-to-1 positive relationship or correlation between money supply, M, and price level, P. That's right. Because we're saying that if MV and V is constant, according to the assumption of the model, and output here is real output is constant. That means if I increase money supply or double it, price will also double, increase double. If I decrease the money supply by twofold, price is going to decrease by twofold. So they move in the same direction. So let's do an example to clear that up. We show you that there's a one-to-one relationship between money supply, changes in money supply, and changes in the general price level in the economy. That's what that model is going to predict. So we're saying that suppose M was 1,000 and suppose V was 4. And then suppose Y was, say, 500. And let's say P was 4. This is YR. So that means that how it could, this thing is gonna balance. So MV equals to PYR. So M is what? 1,000 times V, which is what? Times 4 must equal to P, which is what? 4 times 500. So you can see 2,000. Oh no, this one not gonna balance. Let's make this one. That was a poor selection of numbers. This has to be 4,000. So this I can make this one be 8. Yes, P is 8. That's right. That work. So you see that 4,000 equals to 4,000. Now let's say, suppose the Fed doubles, increase the money supply, doubles money supply, M to 2,000. What happens to price? You're going to see that price will also double. What happens to P? When the Fed doubles the money supply from 1,000 to 2,000, the model predicts, and remember, one-to-one relationship between, positive relationship between money supply and what? And price level. So what you're going to do here, you're just going to say, well, holding other factors constant, because M, V is not going to change, must equal to P, Y, R. So this is not going to change. So now we're saying that the Fed has increased the money supply to 2,000. See, we are multiplying velocity. This constant does not change. So velocity is that, by assumption, velocity is still 4. Now we want to see what our price is going to change when we keep real GDP constant, because real GDP does not change by assumption. It's still 500. Real output there. See, now we solve for what the new price level is. So this is going to be 2,000 times 4. That is 8,000 on the left, must equal to 500P. So if I divide both sides by 500, you can see 5 goes into 8. That is 1, remain what? 3, 30. That's going to be 6. So see, P is going to increase to 16. Remember, the initial P was 8. So that means a doubling of money supply. When money supply doubles, the Federal Reserve doubles the money supply from 1,000 to 2,000. The price level is going to double as well from 8 to 16. Doubling means you're multiplying it by 2. Okay? So that means M and P, there's a one-to-one relationship between M and P. If you increase M by what? So that's what the model predicts, ideally. Okay. So kind of like that. That's how I want to add that. So the number of times a dollar bill is spent on final goods and services in a year is called, we talked about that already. That's the velocity of money. That's our definition. So now let's talk about the cause of inflation. So inflation, according to Milton Friedman, who is one of the best in the business, Nobel Prize winning economist from the University of Chicago, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. That means, when I say monetary phenomenon, it means it's mostly caused by the central bank printing money. All right? That's what we say. So so if if real GDP is fixed by the real factor of production, V is stable, then the only thing that can cause an increase in P is an increase in M. We already talked about that. When the Fed doubled the money supply in our example, price level doubles. So in other words, inflation is caused by an increase in the supply of money. So the quantity theory of money also says that the growth rate of money supply will be approximately equal to the what? Equal to inflation rate. That's right. So if if the Fed increases the money supply by 5%, prices are going to rise by about 5% because we are holding real GDP and what? Velocity constant. Let's look at the evidence, because the model is suggesting that there's almost a one-to-one positive relationship between what? Money supply growth and inflation, and a one-to-one relationship between money supply itself and price level. So you can see that when for a country, if you include this scatter plot here, see, there's almost 20%. You see that, look at that. These numbers almost, even they may not be a one-to-one, but you can see there's a positive correlation between money supply and inflation rate. They may not be one-to-one, but they're very close. So that means nations with rapidly growing money supplies and had high inflation rates. Nation with slowly growing money supply had low inflation. So the only cure to inflation is that central banks should not print money. They should not be dumping a lot of money in the economy, because that causes prices to go up, causes inflation. So as indicate, and that this is true. When you think about what inflation has been baffling America over the past few, couple of years, maybe 1 or 2 years post-COVID. Part of it because supply chain, but most of it is due to because remember, when we shut down the economy, we bail out Americans. We send them checks in the mail. That's increasing money in the economy. It's increasing spending. And what are we paying for now? Higher prices. We're paying for the cost of government bailouts during COVID bailouts. There were a lot of money that went out into the American economy. Some of them for good whatever, though, for like vaccine distribution, but also we also bail out America. We send checks in the mail for Americans. So the party began after lockdown had ended, right? It's like we let the dogs out to spend all the COVID bailouts that they received during COVID, during lockdown. So I say deflation is a decrease in our deflation is the opposite of inflation. Disinflation is a reduction in inflation rate. So disinflation is the action taken by the central bank to reduce inflation. So the central bank is trying to disinflate. And later in the chapter, the last chapter, which is on monetary policy, we're going to talk about how the Fed can reduce inflation. They can reduce inflation by raising interest rates and cutting the money supply. We talked about that the Fed won't be disinflating, yes. So an unexpected increase in the money supply can boost the economy in the short run. As firms and workers come to expect and adjust to the new influx of money, output will not grow any faster than normal in the long run. So in the long run, money is neutral, meaning that in the long run, money does not cause output to change anymore. If you print money when the economy is already stable, when all the economy's productive capability have been maximized, the result is inflation. So let's talk about, now that we know that the main cause of inflation is printing money, excessive printing of money by the central bank, like by the Federal Reserve or anything. If you're Zimbabwe, that would be the Central Bank of Zimbabwe. If you're Australia, that would be the Reserve Bank. And by the way, every country that has got their money, they also have their own central bank that print that money, that is in charge printing that money. The central bank, so countries just name their central banks differently. Our central bank here is called the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve is a US governmental entity, the central bank that is in charge printing and disbursing the dollars in the economy. Okay? That's the role of the Fed. Fed controls the supply of dollars in the economy and interest rates. If you go to China, the name of the Chinese central bank is the People's Bank of China. That's the Chinese, they call it the People's Bank of China. The Canadian central bank is a bank of what? The Bank of Canada. In England, it's the Bank of England. The Bank of England is in charge controlling the supply of the UK pound sterling, which is a British money, into the British economy. The Bank of Canada is in charge controlling the supply of the Canadian dollars in the Canadian economy. The Central Bank of Mexico is called Banco de Mexico. So Banco de Mexico is in charge controlling the supply of the Mexican peso in the Mexican economy. Okay. If you go to Thailand, The Central Bank of Thailand controls the supply of the Thai baht. Okay. The Thailand currency is called the baht, B-A-H-T. Thai baht in the Malaysian economy. You go to South Africa, the Central Bank of South Africa, okay, the Bank of South Africa is in charge controlling the supply of the what? South African rand. The South African money is called the rand into the South African economy. You go to Australia, their central bank is called the Reserve Bank of Australia. New Zealand, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. You go to Sweden, that's the Riksbank of Sweden. And then there's a group of European countries which are part of the Euro currency zone. That was not the case before 1999. Before 1999, the Euro currency was not there. The Euro currency started in 1999. A group of countries in Europe, a lot of them in the EU, most of them in the EU, came together and say, we want to adopt a common currency called the euro. And by the way, there's a common misconception. People always misconceive that being part of the European Union is also a part of the euro currency zone. That is not true. There are now 27 countries in the EU, in the European Union. Before Britain exited, there was a Brexit a couple of years ago. There were 28 countries. So even if Britain was part of the European Union just a couple of years ago before they exited, Britain did not adopt the euro. They continue to use the pound sterling, even though they're part of the European Union. So out of the 27 EU countries that are now, only about 17 out of those 28 countries use the euro. But before these 17 countries adopted a common currency, each country used to have their own currency. Like the Bank of France used to print they control the supply of the French francs. The French money was called the francs. The Bank of Switzerland was to control the supply of the Swiss money, which was called the Swiss francs. The German Bundesbank was the central bank of Germany that controlled the supply of the German Deutschmark. The German money is called the Deutschmark, and so on and so forth. So so talk about that. Riksbank control the supply of this. And by the Sweden is also one of those, is a member of the European Union, but it's not a member of the European currency zone. Sweden uses their own currency called the Swedish krona. And then the Czech Republic is a member of the EU. Czech also use what? They use the Czech krona. Okay, they refuse to adopt the euro. Okay. So now that we know that the cause of inflation is always a central bank, which is an institution that controls the supply of dollars in an economy, printing money. Let's discuss some of the costs of inflation. What are some of the costs that inflation poses on society? So there are 4 problems associated with inflation. One of them that there is price confusion and money illusion. I'm going to talk about what money illusion is. Okay, and then there's going to be inflation is going to redistribute wealth. And then inflation also interacts with other taxes. We're going to talk about, and inflation is painful to stop. So let's look one by one. So inflation makes price signals more difficult to interpret. If you don't know what prices are going to be tomorrow, because prices are jumping up so fast. First of all, it comes with a lot of problems. It can distort financial planning. If you're planning for a small business, most businesses like to plan like 5 years out. But if you don't know what the cost of your raw material goods are going to be, because inflation becomes unpredictable once it starts rising, then that's going to distort financial planning for your small business. But most importantly, it's not always clear whether prices are rising because of increased demand or because of an increase in money supply. We sometimes mistake inflation for higher wages and prices in real terms. That is not true. Resources are wasted in activities that appear profitable but are not, and resources flow more slowly to profitable users. I want to give you one example. If, let's say, what we're talking about, money illusion. If you're the producer of corn, that's the only good you produce. You're a farmer who produces corn. When the price of corn increases and you don't verify whether the prices of all other goods that you don't produce have also increased, you're going to suffer what they call the money illusion. Because why? You're going to be tempted as a corn farmer to increase production of corn because you think you're going to make profit with higher corn prices. But as you make decision to increase preparing your land to plant more corn, you'll soon realize that the price of the raw material goods, the tractors that you need to bring on the farm, they have also gone up. So you're gonna say, so you may end up, so it could be that the price of tractor might have even gone up disproportionately more than the increase in the price of the corn. So your production cost is gonna exceed your what? Your revenue at the end. So you could end, so you're gonna suffer what they call money illusion. So anybody who only thinks that an increase in the price of a good that they control is the only thing that has gone up without verifying whether the price of everything has gone up suffers what we call money illusion. Okay, you're gonna make bad choices, bad decisions. So money illusion is when people mistake changes in nominal prices for changes in real prices. That is true. And then the second effect of inflation is that inflation redistributes wealth. Inflation is a type of tax that transfers real resources from citizens to the government. Or inflation is a real return that lenders receive on what? So let me talk about it this way. Let me discuss this more carefully so that you guys see what we're talking about here. It's like saying, if the price of lunch is $10 today, I want to show you how inflation is going to redistribute wealth from borrowers, from lenders to borrowers. So if the price of lunch today is this is lunch, is $10 today. That means if a bank lends you $100 today, this $100, this is equivalent to what? How many lunches? This is equivalent to remember, you have $100 that the bank has given you in loans, but lunch costs $10. So that's equivalent to 10 lunches. So when the bank lends you $100 today, when lunch is $10, it is as if the bank has given you 10 lunches today. Let's say you'll pay back this money next year. So next year, when you pay back your loan, next year, when you pay back, suppose price of lunch, let me write it in full, price of lunch jumps to $20. So lunch is twice as more expensive than it was today, tomorrow. Tomorrow means next year. So that means you will be paying back $100. The $100 that you're paying back to the bank, divide by the price of lunch tomorrow, can only buy 5 lunches. Is that fair to the bank? Of course it's not. The bank gave you something that could buy you 10 lunches today, this year. I know when you're paying back because inflation rose unexpectedly that the bank wasn't even expecting it, price went up by $20. That's inflation going up like 100%. Then now lunch is gonna be what? The $100 you would be paying back the bank is only what? Can only buy 5 lunches. The bank gave you something that could buy 10 lunches. Now you're paying them back something that buys what? Only 5 lunches. So that is inflation redistributing wealth from lenders to borrowers. So borrowers gain when there's inflation, when inflation rises during the course when they're borrowed funds. With deflation, because deflation is the opposite of inflation. When there's when prices fall, then again, borrowers are going to get screwed in that case. The inflation is going to redistribute wealth from borrowers to lenders. Lenders gain with deflation, and borrowers lose out. But inflation is going to redistribute wealth from lenders to borrowers. Borrowers gain with inflation, and lenders lose. So that's the kind of redistribution of wealth I'm talking about here. Inflation reduces the real return that lenders receive on loans, transferring wealth from lenders to borrowers. When inflation and interest rates fall unexpectedly, wealth is redistributed from borrowers who are paying higher rates to lenders. Okay, that is like the opposite. When there's deflation, the wealth is going to be redistributed from what? From borrowers or lenders. So a decrease in the average level of price is called, we talked about that, that is deflation. Now let's talk about the real rate of return. Okay, we're about to finish this chapter. So the real rate of return is a nominal rate of return minus inflation. Okay, you can write the formula very clearly here. What? The real rate of return, real rate of return equals to nominal rate of return minus inflation. For example, if you buy a US Treasury bond, you invest in the US Treasury bond, and the government says they're going to pay you 10% on a 1-year US Treasury bond. That is a nominal rate of return, 10%. So after 1 year, when the government pays you, you invested, you bought US Treasury bonds. So after 1 year, the government is going to pay you back your money with the interest of 10%. That is not how much you're earning in real terms. Your real rate of return is going to be the 10% that the government is paying you on your investment minus any potential inflation. If inflation during the course of the year was 5%, then your real rate of return is only 5%. That's what it is. You have to account for inflation. So that leads us to the relationship between the lender's real rate of return and the nominal rate of return and the inflation rate. Okay, so we can talk about the real interest rate. Okay, so we're gonna, here's gonna be our notation. I'm gonna define it shortly, what they mean. Okay. So my notation here is gonna say, we are gonna define the variable pi. Pi is gonna be our notation for inflation. And then I is gonna be our notation for nominal interest rate. So you really know what inflation is, but what is nominal inflation? So nominal interest rate. Nominal interest rate is the quoted, is defined as the quoted interest rate on a loan or investment. This interest rate, which is a nominal interest rate, is not adjusted for inflation. It is not adjusted for inflation. For example, you go to the bank and the bank says, we're going to give you a loan with 10%, a car loan with 10% interest on it. That 10% quoted interest rate on that loan is nominal interest rate. It's not adjusted for inflation. So the other interest rate, which you should care about, everybody cares about, is the real interest rate. So my notation here, I want to make sure that I'm consistent. Is R real. So R real is going to be our notation for real interest rate. So this is nominal interest rate after which adjusts for inflation, which adjusts for inflation. So you can call it the inflation adjusted interest rate, just for inflation. So that means the formula is very easy. The real interest rate is given as you take the nominal interest rate, which is I, minus inflation. You can write this formula in three different ways. If you want to make I the subject, that means you're adding pi to both sides. So you can say, or you can write this as nominal interest rate equals to real interest rate plus inflation. Or if you want to make inflation the subject, then means pi, or you can also write as pi equals to nominal interest rate minus real interest rate. These three formulas can be used interchangeably to mean the same thing. Okay. So there's an economist from MIT called Dr. Alvin Fisher, who developed this relationship. The Fisher effect is the tendency of nominal interest rates to rise with expected inflation. Okay. Now, one thing that, so we're knowing that, so let's talking about, so we're saying that nominal interest rate, I want to make something clear here, equals to real interest rate plus inflation. Okay. Now, I'm not writing this in form. This is pi. Pi stands for inflation. Let's be consistent. Now, what happened is that when banks are giving you, this inflation we're talking about is inflation that is known today. But when a bank is giving you a loan today, that loan is not going, they're not expecting you to pay that loan immediately. You may be paying back, if it's a business loan, sometimes you're paying back in 10 years or 5 years. So that means the relevant inflation that the bank should look at when they give out loans today is not current inflation. It's what we're going to call future inflation or forecast inflation. What is the bank predicting inflation to be 5 years from now? That's a more relevant interest rate. Inflation that is necessary for banks to loan money and charge this interest rate. So we're going to define E pi. This is you can call it future inflation. Remember, future inflation is not known, but it's forecast. You can forecast it, or it can be predicted. You can call it future or forecast interest rate, or you can call it expected. So expected inflation. Okay, or predicted. So that means the relevant nominal interest rate, which is a Fisher equation, you take the real interest rate plus expected inflation. We use expected as opposed to current inflation. That's the more relevant inflation that is necessary for banks to what? To charge an interest rate today. I work for Capital One. Before I went to get my PhD, I took a time like a year and a half. So I was there, one of their credit analysts and time series analysts. So I used to predict, forecast inflation for Capital One and advise my seniors to build this into their what? Into their lending strategy. Okay, because Capital One was giving a lot of like mortgage and auto loans. So if you give somebody an auto loan, they're gonna pay back, maybe they bought in 72 months. 60 months, which is like 5 years. So in 5 years, when they fully pay off their loan, their auto loan, if inflation rises unexpectedly, the banks might get screwed because they might have charged a very lower interest rate on that loan. So to prevent that from happening, the bank would hire us, statistician, to predict what future values of inflation is, so that the bank is informed about the relevant interest rate they need to charge across different risk groups that are borrowing money from Capital One. Okay, so these are some of the things that you can implement, using data and statistical model to make this prediction. So inflation redistributes wealth. So when lenders expect inflation to increase, okay. So now look at this equation. Like you guys, if you're asking me, why do you think interest rates in America are so high today? The mortgage rates are averaging 7-8%. It's because of inflation. So there's a one-to-one relationship between when people like banks are expecting inflation to be rising in the economy, because they know when inflation rises, it's gonna reduce the value of the dollars they give you in loans. So to prevent that from happening, the banks are gonna increase interest rates. So nominal interest rates that the banks charge on the loans will always increase almost 1-to-1 with expected inflation. When the banks are expecting inflation to be 5% higher next year, they may increase interest rate on a loan today by 5%, increase it by 5% to compensate for the potential loss in the value of the dollar they're going to give out as loans due to inflation. And the converse is true. When banks are expecting deflation, prices to fall in the future, lower inflation, they may lower interest rates as well. Because we know when lenders expect inflation to increase, they will demand a higher nominal interest rate. So the Fisher effect says that the nominal interest rate is equal to the expected inflation rate plus the equilibrium real interest rate. It also says that nominal rate will rise with expected inflation. That's right. Nominal interest rates always rise with expected inflation. So if you turn this now, you call this some kind of equilibrium real interest rate, which is your real interest rate. Okay, equilibrium rate of return. We're assuming that that equilibrium rate of return is constant, does not change. So that means anytime expected inflation rises, this E pi, banks are going to raise interest rate by the same amount. Okay, so there's a 1-to-1 relation. So that 1-to-1 relationship is what we call the Fisher effect. The Fisher effect predicts a 1. So the Fisher effect predicts a 1-to-1 positive relationship between nominal interest rate I and expected inflation, which is E pi. Meaning that it's a 1-to-1 relationship. If banks are expecting inflation to rise 1 percentage point, they're going to jack up your nominal interest rate on the loans by 1%. If they expect expected inflation to go up 5%, they will raise interest rate by 5%, and so on and so forth. So yeah, and the Fisher effect is the prediction from a Fisher effect is it comes almost close to reality. So these are data for the actual data from the United States Federal Reserve. You can see these are the blue line, that is inflation rate in America. And then you can see the nominal interest rate at the red line. You see those things move together, meaning that when inflation is rising, interest rate that banks charge on a loan would also rise. When inflation falls, interest rate falls, and so on and so forth. So changes in inflation in the economy is a good predictor of what? Of interest rate. And you can use that for your what? Business strategy if you ever own a business. If you say your business was planning to borrow $1 million for investment, but somebody tells you that, oh, inflation might be rising in the near future. So it makes sense to borrow it today when maybe banks are still not, when things are not, inflation has not yet appeared yet, because interest rate would still be very low. Okay. So inflation reduce a bit well. So think about that. So if expected inflation is less than inflation, real rate is less than equilibrium rate, this harms lenders and borrowers and benefits borrowers. That's true. But if expected inflation is greater than actual inflation, what people are predicting, then this is going to benefit lenders and it harms borrowers. Okay? Because the idea there is that when expected inflation is greater than actual inflation today, the banks are going to raise interest rates on the loans they give. So that's going to harm borrowers. But if expected inflation equals to inflation today, there's going to be no rate equal to equilibrium rate, so no redistribution of wealth. So neither the borrower nor the lender will be affected here. And then the other concept that we're going to talk about is monetizing the debt. When the government pays off its debt by printing money, that would be foolish government. Think about the US debt. Our debt is at close to $34 trillion as we talk today. If the US government were to just print money, print the dollars let's just print dollars and pay off the debt. That would be one of the dumbest ideas ever. Why? Because we have seen that printing money is going to destroy the economy, causes inflation. Okay, we don't want to wake up with an economy like Zimbabwe or Germany of 1920s after World War I. Okay, I showed you the data early on how the inflation was rising in those countries, or Venezuela. So inflation redistributes a government with massive debt as an incentive to increase the money supply since it benefits from unexpected inflation. The government doesn't always inflate its debt away for two reasons. If lenders expect inflation, they will increase the interest rate on the government bonds, government debt. Then the government will not have the ability to borrow. And buyers of bonds are often also voters who would be upset if real return on their investment, treasury bonds are what? Their real return are shrinking. So that is going to make the government not printing money to pay off government debt would be a bad idea for any government out there for those reasons. So the government monetizes debt by printing money to pay off the debt. That's debt monetization. Yes, we talked about that. Still more. Okay, few more remaining. Okay. So when nominal interest rates are not allowed to rise and the inflation rate is high, the real rate of return will be negative. So in some places, some governments around the world, like governments that are run by dictators, they sometimes have controls on how much banks can charge on interest rate. They can say beyond a certain level, you cannot increase interest rate because of what they call interest rate gouging. They don't want price gouging on what? On borrowers. Okay. So if that's the case, if interest rates are not allowed to rise and inflation is rising, then that means the real rate of return can be negative. Because remember, the real rate of return, again, to remind you, equals to nominal rate of return minus inflation. I don't know why I keep writing fully SPY, right? So what I'm saying is that if the government does not allow this guy to rise, they set a fixed controlling interest rate cannot rise. If inflation is rising all the time, this guy is constant. This difference can be negative. The real rate of return can be negative. And people take their money out of the banking system in that case because it doesn't make any sense that if I deposit my money on a savings account, my return is negative. Okay? That is not a good idea. And then the supply of savings falls and financial intermediation becomes less efficient. Negative real interest rates reduce financial intermediation and economic growth. That's true. When inflation is volatile and unpredictable, long-term loans become riskier. So banks sometimes refuse to give long-term loans. Few long-term contracts will be signed. Any contract involving future payments will be affected by inflation. Okay. So most tax systems define incomes, profit, and capital gains in nominal. So this is one of the things that you guys that I hate the most, and because I also invest like you. Maybe some of you invest your money in stocks, bonds, and whatever. When the government is taxing you, the government taxes your nominal gains. Okay, they don't tax your real gain, and to me that is an unfair tax treatment. Okay, let's talk about it here. I want to give you an example of what I'm talking about here. That inflation brings in unfair tax treatment of taxpayers. So let's say that suppose you invested $10,000 on January 1, 2024 on Bitcoins. Just pretend. And then you sold that investment on December 31, 2024 for $11,000. Okay. So for a capital gains, that's a capital gains of what? For $1,000. That's how much you've gained. Gains of $1,000. By law, you're supposed to pay taxes on this $1,000. That's a capital gain. That's an income that accrued to you on your investment. So the US government might say, government may tax 20% of that $1,000. Which means you owe what? That means you owe $200 to the US government. No, yes, $200. You owe $200 in taxes. You need to file, when you file your taxes in next year, you know, April 15th, the tax filing deadline, you need to report that income and pay that $200 in taxes. But what if inflation equals to 10% during 2024? See what I'm talking about here? The US government does not care whether, because inflation reduces the value of your investment. Okay, you guys see what I'm talking about here? Inflation reduces the value of your investment. So that means even though you earn $1,000, the value of that $1,000 in real terms is not $1,000 because inflation is 10% of that. So in other words, remember, the government, this is what should have happened. If the government was fair enough to taxpayers, they would be taxing your real income. Okay? Because your real return here is given by, you made $11,000 profit, so $1,000 profit. $1,000 profit, you invested $10,000. That is 10%. You made 10%. So it's going to be the nominal return minus inflation. So in other words, your nominal return is 10%, but inflation is also 10%. So in other words, your real return is zero. You did not make any money because inflation wiped out all that $1,000. The real value of your $11,000 has gone down by $1,000 if inflation is 10% throughout 2024. So ideally, the government should not tax you. But the problem, the government does not tax. When the government is taxing you, that tax is based on nominal, not real return. The government is going to say, well, you owe us $200 on the $1,000. So that's how inflation brings an unfair tax treatment to taxpayers, because taxes are based on nominal income, not real returns. Nominal return, not real return on investments. And that's, as I say, that's unfair. And inflation is painful to stop when it starts. The government can reduce inflation by reducing growth in the money supply. When inflation is expected, lower inflation may be misinterpreted as a reduction in demand. So firms are going to reduce output and employment. Workers may become unemployed as an unexpected increase in their real wage makes them unaffordable. Expectation will eventually adjust in the long run. That's the end of my, here are just a few takeaways, a summary of what we talked about. So again, this lecture is the recording is gonna be made available for you. I need to convert it to a permanent YouTube link and it will be posted at Canvas. So up to this point, we are only left with 2 chapters, and those 2 chapters are gonna be, the recording should be available to you by Monday evening. Okay. All right. So I'll talk to you guys soon. Thank you very much. Bye.